Welcome to The Impact Equation, conversations with leaders shaping a brighter future, with me, Adam Pike.
And me, Rafi Adelstein. With our special guests, we unlock the secrets of those who dare to transform our world. We talk to architects of change, pioneers in their fields, working towards a brighter future for us all. In each episode, we dig into each element of the impact equation. Today's guest is Ioannis Ioannou, a tenured professor at London Business School and a leading thinker on the role of business in society. Ioannis graduated from Yale and Harvard with a Ph.D. in business economics from the Harvard Business School. He joined the London Business School in 2009 and has become a leading contributor to top academic journals, sharing his research on what it means for businesses to deliver for the greater good.
Alongside his research work and teaching, Ioannis is a sought-after advisor and non-exec, advising global corporations on their sustainability strategy, and as a member of the World Economic Forum Experts Network. Ioannis, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. Very much look forward to the conversation today.
Great. So, Ioannis, you've had a really stellar academic background and probably could have chosen to do almost anything. Why dedicate your career to sustainability in academia?
Well, actually, Adam, it was a bit of an existential crisis. When you do a PhD, you need to have one of those at some point to make sure that you're doing the right thing and you stay in it after 6 years. So when I joined LBS, I had this, I settled, I got a job after my PhD, and I was thinking, okay, well, I need to devote my career to something that really makes me jump out of bed in the morning, but also something that is meaningful. And at that point in time, I was like, okay, this is the time to reorient, to think. And I always had this peripheral vision of what is the contribution of businesses to society. And this was back in 2009, by the way, towards the tail end of the financial crisis as well. So the context, the personal motivation, the intellectual curiosity to find something that, it's meaningful. In other words, why do I study companies? Why do I study business? Towards what end? It's not the study in and of itself. It had to have a purpose, if you like. So that's where back then it was called social responsibility, right? Corporate social responsibility came into the picture, and that was what personally motivated me and gave me that purpose to ultimately even stay in this profession.
Ioannis, you've done some really fascinating work on what you've called responsible organizations. I was wondering if you could unpack that for us. Like, what does a responsible organization look like? Why do you think they're better equipped to outperform traditional corporates?
So there's two aspects to that, Adam. So first of all is what is an organization and whether it outperforms, right? So in my definition, and you probably can find many definitions out there, a responsible organization is an organization that accounts for this social and environmental context that we talked about, and more specifically understands that as a business, if you want to be profitable, if you want to be a successful business, well, you cannot do that on a dead planet, right? So it's about, well, at the very least, not worsening the planet, not worsening us in terms of our position within the planetary boundaries, but perhaps ultimately using your innovation and scaling up capability to positively contribute towards solving some of those challenges. Right. So that's for me what the responsible organization looks like. It doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. Sometimes you might have conflicting demands and expectations, right? But there's a difference between intentions and outcomes. So when I talk about the responsibility here in the way you asked the question, I'm talking about intentions. Now, if you're a business that accounts for the shifting competitive landscape, well, of course you're going to perform better because you're a more agile business. You understand your customers better. You understand your supply chains better, for instance, right? You understand your shareholders better. However, that's not inevitable. And this is something that's been bugging me quite a bit in recent months even, because sometimes you see markets reacting in a very short-term way, and sometimes they even penalize, right, companies that are doing the right thing. And that's worrisome. And that goes back to my argument that there is a misalignment between the markets and the objective scientific reality where we are right now. So for instance, when Trump got elected in the US, green stocks plummeted, right? And so did healthcare stocks because Robert Kennedy could become the new head of the Department of Health, right? In my view, that's an absurd reaction. The world's ecological problems did not go away because Trump got elected, and definitely vaccines did not become a hoax because Robert Kennedy is going to go at the Department of Health. But that's how the market reacted. So for me, there's a question of, well, yeah, of course, markets react to news and they try to maximize profits. But if they do that entirely without accounting the hard realities that vaccines work, for instance, and that we are compromising planetary boundaries, then that creates the question of, well, how is this misalignment going to be resolved? Well, nature is not going to compromise with us. So ultimately, we're going to face enough crises to have a disorderly transition that would force us, whether extreme weather events or perhaps another pandemic, for instance. So there is a sense in which if there was no gap with reality, yes, of course, genuine environmental and social efforts ought to be rewarded and be profitable. However, there are gaps in the broader system that sometimes may not only not allow them to be profitable, but may actually penalize them. And as if I were a government or a policymaker, that's the gaps I would really be working on right now.
And this wasn't meant to be the way, right? Over the past sort of 10, 15 years since you started this journey, we've had CSR transition into corporate purpose and SDGs, and we've seen that shift into sort of sustainability and sustainability as a growth driver and sort of green premium and all this kind of stuff and green growth. And the question, I suppose, is, are we running to the end of that journey with geopolitical challenges, with degrowth as a growing movement? Or do you think there is still hope for the capitalist system as a means of driving towards an orderly transition and a positive future?
I think in the 15, 16 years I've been in this line of work, I've seen it from being a peripheral issue to mainstreaming and now becoming controversial and toxic, right? In some respects, there are silver linings. In other words, if I hadn't seen this anti-sustainability or anti-ESG backlash, I wouldn't be sure that it was actually working. It is exactly because it's working and upsetting vested interests, right? And sometimes corrupt vested interests that you see this ideological pushback, I think. So that the silver lining is that if ESG or sustainability did not matter, why would people bother to oppose to it? Now, that's part of the story. Of course, the movement has its deficiencies, the way we measure things. There's a lot of greenwashing, for instance, and so forth. So we also need these self-correcting mechanisms. For instance, increase the level and quality of transparency in order to avoid or eliminate greenwashing, in order to better understand the impacts, and so on and so forth. So I'm optimistic in the sense that there are self-correcting mechanisms. But what we need to keep in mind is that you and I and everyone, right, especially in the political sphere, we may discuss or, this is falling out of fashion or is going to be replaced by AI and other considerations and so on and so forth. The underlying issues haven't changed. The underlying actual environmental issues have become worse, if anything. The underlying sociological issues haven't changed. The income inequalities, the inequalities with minority groups, with racial groups, with other minorities, so those haven't changed. It's the conversation that has changed and created the fallacy, in my view at least, that somehow the problems are going away or we can sweep them under the rug and then go on with what we used to be, the likes of Make America Great Again, and that these issues are not going to come back and bite us, which is the worst fallacy we could fall into right now. And we are falling into it, unfortunately. Personally, I don't have a preference whether you want to call this ESG, sustainability, corporate social responsibility. What I do care about is whether companies are understanding the risks, and whether at least some of them are looking at the opportunities, and whether they understand that this misalignment with reality is going to come back and bite all of us, meaning, from companies to governments to all societal stakeholders.
Anti-ESG activism, we've sort of referenced here, there's been a lot of noise, and again, it seems to be gaining momentum.
Of course.
Often critics saying that ESG is driven by a left-wing agenda or woke capitalism. How do you help, or how would you advise a company to respond to those claims?
That's the $1 million question, Adam. Listen, I mean, you asked me about books earlier, and I just finished actually this week reading Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari. I'm not sure if you have read the book. It's a wonderful book, actually, that dispels this whole myth of, and as an academic, I think it was a bit of an eye-opener, because we always thought, and many of us did have this naive view of the world, that if we put out more information, if we increase the level of information and the level of connectivity, that truth and revealing the truth would become easier. Actually, he makes the counter argument, which is very convincingly, that most of the world's information is junk, right? And then he says that himself, and I think I'm totally sold on that idea. So I think that this anti-ESG movement, in some respects, it has identified deficiencies with the movement. For example, the lack of standardization of metrics, a lot of greenwashing, we have so many corporate scandals, for instance, of companies that try to deceive us in what they do. So there was a foundation to it, and it's good to reveal those deficiencies in order to fix them. However, there's a very important component that is purely ideological and kind of misrepresents what ESG does, right, or did. So, for instance, and it's kind of interesting that it's coming from the right-hand side of the political spectrum to encourage companies or to prohibit companies from accounting for risks, which is what some states did in the US, for instance, right? They regulated so that asset managers or even pension funds did not integrate ESG. It was like, well, first of all, that's interventionist. And for a free market advocate, that already sounds bizarre. But on top of that, you're trying to put your companies at a disadvantage by regulating them not to account for risks. How is that consistent with fiduciary duty, for instance? And the answer to that is that, in my perspective, is that this is clearly not a conservative idea or ideology. This is clearly a populist ideology where you frame the ESG issue together with the DEI as the liberal elite, and then you attack them on ideological grounds, right? So I think that's what we've seen in the US. What kind of encourages me, though, and again, silver lining, is that luckily this approach has not transferred well outside the US context, right? We've seen attempts, even in the UK, even in the last election cycle, for these ideas of woke capitalism or wokeness to be imported. But I think that the UK public has rejected them or was not interested in having those conversations. So the silver lining is that they haven't traveled as well outside the US.
I appreciate it's challenging circumstances today, but do you see, or has there been times where you've found it easier to be influential as an academic, for your work to lead down the track to actual change? Like, what are the circumstances in which that's possible? And presumably that's what you're working towards. How do you try to get to that stage of, your insight and the learnings and the research you're doing, driving change on the ground?
Yeah, I'm going to say, before the emergence of the anti-ESG and the polarization, clearly it was easier because at that point in time, we had ESG and sustainability being mainstreamed, and there was a sense and a momentum in which folks were understanding the underlying issues as well as the challenges we are facing, and as well as understanding the role of business, policymakers. Again, they were not, and I'm talking 10 years ago, right? They were not yet feeling sort of the pressures of populism. So you can actually have a more nuanced discussion, because ultimately, by the way, and I often say this, and I've written a recent article about this, that it's not left and right, it's just forward. In other words, of course, for a lot of these issues, it's not going to be either a right-wing or a left-wing solution. For some of these issues, yes, we're going to need well-functioning markets. However, for markets to function well, you need robust regulation. So it's not left or right. You need both in order to have effective solutions. Think about the market for carbon credits, for instance. It's a market mechanism, so it's right-wing, so to speak. But if you don't structure the market correctly, as they didn't, then you have a failing market. So you need stronger regulation. So it's not a right or left solution. It's both. So in that respect, when we used to have conversations that were a lot more nuanced and were focused on solving the issue as opposed to focused on promoting a certain ideology, then you can have a more effective discussion. But then there was, this wave of polarization that has contaminated a lot of these discussions, and it's almost impossible to have those discussions. However, personally, what keeps me quite encouraged and quite optimistic is what I see in the MBA and in the executive classroom. And don't forget, we are at London Business School. We are in the European continent, and therefore, which is arguably one of the most advanced regions in the world in terms of understanding environmental and social issues and sustainability. So we are, in a sense, a little bit protected. In other words, I do not need to go into the classroom and argue that businesses, or convince anybody, for instance, that businesses need to have a role, right, or be a force for good, for instance, because a lot of my students, especially the younger generations, they take that for granted. What they're asking me to say is, how do I do this, right? To give you an example, at LBS, we've introduced within the MBA program, you can have a specialization in finance, in strategy, and so on. So we introduced a sustainability ESG specialization, and this year was the second most populated, most declared specialization. All right. And we have over 80, I think, MBA students, which means 1 out of the 5 streams in relative terms has declared ESG and sustainability as a specialization. Same with all the teaching that I do for executives, especially when you speak to senior executives. Of course, they understand, yes, there's geopolitics and so on and so forth, but there is a sense in which, and maybe you guys have detected this as well, I think that above a certain level of seniority, there's people that go into I would say, the giving back part of their career, thinking about their children, or if they don't have children, younger generations, and having a more, I would say, more profound sense of responsibility about their legacy and how that legacy is being framed by what they do for the businesses that they work for, right? So I think that those are at least some of the elements that make me more optimistic, despite what is happening in the public discourse, right? On the ground, you do have many people, even from older or even younger generations or upcoming senior leaders, that really get this, and they also recognize a personal responsibility in addition to sort of a organizational, not all of them, clearly, but enough to keep me optimistic, I would say.
It's so interesting because I think, as you say, people, as they get older in their careers, tend to think about legacy. And it made me reflect on the fact that it seems like this is often about short-term versus long-term. The challenge with the market increasingly is that it tends to be so short-termist in its response to Donald Trump, response to electoral results.
Yeah.
And yet your argument is that actually, when viewed through a longer horizon, actually the implications of your decision might mean that you have no market at all. So whilst you might benefit in the short term of a decision that is against sustainability, not too far down the track, it is going to harm both your market and your business.
Yeah.
And there needs to be better understanding or recognition and weighing of that in the market. But that's a very difficult thing to do.
Right. I mean, actually, I would take it a step further and I'll say, look, given short-term orientation, right, which shouldn't be, by the way, because even if you take a basic finance course, it would tell you that the price of the stock today is supposed to be the net present value of all future cash flows, in principle, right? But what I'm saying, it's even a step further, though, is that the market in and of itself, it's man-made. It's not God-given, right? It didn't evolve, it was not given to us overnight and suddenly there's nothing we can do to change it. It's a construct. It's a social construct that came to be through our effectively laws and regulations. In the same way that companies, what are companies? They're legal entities. They're fictional constructs, right? They're constructs of our imagination and how we structure legal constructs. So sometimes, especially on the more sort of ambitious of executives, if you want, I try to push them to think that, are you sure you want to take this as given? Because you know what? You do have a seat at the table. You do speak with policymakers. There's so many other issues that arguably you lobby for or you ask changes for, right? So why in this domain would you take that as a given, whereas for other laws and regulations, you would argue your case, make your case, and so on and so forth. In other words, we don't need, and this is, by the way, part of the very important argument that Stuart Hart makes in his book, Beyond Shareholder Primacy, that the way the system is endogenous to our decisions, is not given to us, right? We, through our decisions, whether we're corporate leaders or consumers or business schools academics or policymakers, we collectively change the system. I mean, don't forget, guys, right? There was a time when the East India Company had a private army, right? We've come to talk about social responsibility, right? I mean, capitalism has evolved. Yes, there was a time of monopolies and extreme market concentration, and then you had the Great Depression, and then the system recalibrated. Now you have the climate crisis, in addition to COVID and all that kind of stuff, that it's posing those existential challenges. So the crisis is an opportunity to rethink what can we do in this context to frame and to evolve the next evolution of capitalism. Because, and by the way, this is the other thing, we use this word quite freely, again, capitalism, but there's many different types of capitalism across countries, and not and even within the same country, the capitalism of today is not the same as 20 or 50 years ago. So we need to be a bit careful about that, characterizing the system, because the system itself, it's evolving. And that's the whole point, that we collectively have a say in that evolution of the system, and we can affect it.
But unless we're overrun by events, right? So I suppose, to what degree are the execs that you're talking to and the MBA students conscious of the future implications of climate and the impact on our system, and how scared are they of those implications, and how driven are they to try and address them, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, in most of the classes that I do, Rafi, whether it's executive education or degree programs, I actually, on lecture 1, it's about learning about the planetary boundaries. And indeed, it's not as, people might know about climate change and global warming, but they don't know the planetary boundaries framework, and definitely not its iteration where it accounts for social issues. So I was like, well, if you want to run a business and we're going to talk about sustainability, let's start with how the real world looks like according to science, and then we can talk business, right? So I think there's certainly an important degree of awareness that needs to take place. The other thing is, talking about academia, is that, sustainability cannot be seen and should not be seen as an add-on, an elective, something you do in year 2. I'll do regular finance or regular marketing or regular strategy, right, without sustainability. And then in year 2, when I take my elective, I'll do sustainability. That's not how it should work, right? Because, you have to adopt that lens in every aspect of business if you truly believe that, the world is really facing the social and environmental challenges that we're facing today. So that degree of awareness, as well as embedding it into their thinking, is very important. The second that I'm going to mention, and I think it's a very important component for all of us, not just business school students, is personal responsibility. The problem with sustainability has always been that it's someone else's problem. If I recycle, but all of my, colleagues or flatmates don't recycle, or nobody else in the world does, I'm not achieving anything. But you see, that has cascaded. The UK was arguing, well, if we become net zero, but China doesn't, or India doesn't, then we failed again. So and companies say the same. If I recycle and, if I become green and my competitors don't, I'm at a disadvantage. So you see, there was always someone else's responsibility. So especially when I speak to the senior executives, I ask them, does the buck stop with you? Are you going to be that person, that organization that would take responsibility? I cannot make that choice for you, but I can tell you the implications of your choice. If you don't make that choice, here's the path we are on. By the end of the century, we would be at 3 degrees. That's the world you're going to leave behind, objectively speaking, right? I cannot teach, can talk about leadership and so on and so forth, but ultimately leadership is about taking those decisions. So if you want to be at LBS on a senior program and call yourself a leader, here's a leadership challenge, right? Because my grandmother that doesn't have an MBA can take any win-win decision. That's easy, right? You don't need an MBA for that even. How could you go wrong? It's a win-win. But when you have these important, potentially costly sometimes decisions, that's where your responsibility comes in. And that's, by the way, often enough, I recommend this other book to them, which is, maybe you guys read it. It's called The Good Ancestor, which is all about long-term thinking and personal responsibility. It's like, will you be a good ancestor, both in your personal as well as your professional life? So you have to confront them with their responsibility, because someone has to.
Ioannis, we're coming to the end of our time together. Thank you so much for your generosity, and your enthusiasm is also very infectious. So I might have to go and do an MBA at LBS just to, to attend a few more of your lectures. But can you finish perhaps with one message of hope for 2025, given that we're at the start of the year? One reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, I am going to quote one of my favorite scientist, Michael Mann, M-A-N-N. Perhaps you guys know him. He has some fantastic books out. And what I love in what he says, and I have adopted it, is that there is urgency, but there is also agency. In other words, there might be a narrowing window of opportunity, but there is still an opportunity. And it's not just Michael Mann. All of the scientists are telling us this. So provided that there is an opportunity, why choose to be pessimistic? Choose to be optimistic. And then the second kind of message, if you allow me, is that pessimism is easy. It takes no effort. You can resign to it. What choice did you make? Pessimism and resigning to the fate of ecological disaster it's the easy solution out. And I'm Greek. They taught me that you never take the easy way. You take the way of virtue, right? And the way of virtue is, in this case, to be optimistic against all odds, because that's when you take responsibility and you make choices. And that's what also makes me personally optimistic.
Ioannis, thank you very much.
Great to finish.
Thank you so much to both of you for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so Adam, great chat with Ioannis. Covered lots of different topics and ground. What did you make of it?
So again, I just loved his enthusiasm and passion, as I said at the end there. For me, I think the challenge is that populism is on the march. Rejection of ESG is becoming more commonplace. And I think that we need to be, when I say we, kind of academics like Ioannis need to be as muscular and as assertive as possible in putting the case forward. And that for me is critical. And I think there is a moral argument that we need to be making more forcefully about the fact that we have a moral imperative to protect our environment, to protect our ecosystem. But also there is then also an economic and financial argument too. And I sometimes feel in these conversations that we conflate all of those different aspects, and the argument can be a bit too theoretical, and we just need to bring it home to people, bring it home to people, bring it home to people. Like, what does it all mean? How do you feel about using a product at home that was made by a child?
Yeah.
Like your child. Whilst it might have been cheaper to produce, do you feel shame? So I think that we need to be stating the case more assertively in that regard. I don't know. How about you, Refi?
I'm thinking about, how he framed his role as an academic as sort of the pursuit of truth. And it made me think, like, what's the difference between an academic and a journalist when you're talking about such relevant, immediate, pressing, urgent matters that are current? Is there a difference? Because in a way, he's operating as kind of like a commentator on the today, on the now, and he's doing investigations into the truth of the role of business society and the relationship between the two. And he's making a comment on that importance of the role of business in a way that maybe a journalist would. So I think I'm interested in exploring that maybe further. Maybe we speak to a journalist and see how they interact with academics. I'd say, we didn't quite get into some of his research. Like, Ioannis is one of the sort of stellar leading thinkers on this space, a bit like others like Professor Serafame and Alex Edmonds and people like that who I've interacted with over the years. And he has a really, compelling story to tell on what it takes to become a purpose-led sustainable business. We didn't really quite get into that, and there's lots more that he could have said. But I'm really pleased that we sort of talked about the really pressing issues of the day, and the sort of anti-woke agenda that you referenced, I think is really what people are really grappling with, what he's grappling with right now. So I'm pleased that we did do that.
Yeah, I might start calling it the stupidity agenda. Might hopefully cut through a little bit more, maybe use some of Donald Trump's language against him. There's something kind of woke about anti-woke, using the phraseology.
Yeah, it's a bit like some of the most religious people we know are atheists or dogmatic atheists, right? You know, you're sort of applying a religious lens to, similarly, sort of the most committed people to sustainability are those that are opposed to it.
Exactly. Rafi, great to talk. See you next time.
See you next time on The Impact Equation.